Saipan, July 1944. The fighting has barely stopped echoing through the ravines when a small group of Japanese women steps out from behind a shattered limestone ridge. Smoke lingers low across the ground, drifting between broken trees and collapsed shelters. Their clothes are torn, their faces pale with exhaustion, and their hands tremble as they hold torn white cloths above their heads, a gesture they were never raised to make. For hours, they expected death. That is what they had been taught. That surrender meant dishonor. That Americans would show no mercy. But the scene before them does not match the stories whispered through the caves. Instead of rifles raised or shouted threats, a quiet detachment of U.S. Marines stands at a cautious distance, waiting. One medic kneels as he opens a metal water canteen. Another gestures gently for the women to come forward. The wind rustles through the palm fronds overhead, the only sound in a silence too strange to trust. The women hesitate, unable to understand why the enemy is not striking. And in that stillness, the moment begins, the moment when Japanese female prisoners would realize Americans were about to treat them not as captives, but as equals. The story of Japanese women who surrendered on Saipan cannot be separated from the forces that shaped them long before the American Marines ever appeared on the beaches. Their disbelief in humane treatment did not begin in 1944. It was molded by decades of ideology, wartime propaganda, and a rigid national hierarchy that defined every aspect of Japanese life in the early 20th century. By the time the Pacific War reached its midpoint, Japanese society was governed by a powerful mixture of honor, loyalty, and fear. The Meiji-era values that emphasized obedience to the emperor had intensified through years of militarization. Women, in particular, were raised under a doctrine known as Ryo Saikenbo, good wife, wise mother. Their duty was to support the nation silently, faithfully, and without question. During wartime, this expectation sharpened. Women were expected to inspire courage in men and embody resilience at home. Surrender, even for civilians, was considered unthinkable. As Japan's empire expanded across Asia and the Pacific, civilian women increasingly found themselves drawn into military roles. Some served as nurses in field hospitals. Others worked as clerks, supply assistants, or communications aides. Many were sent to distant islands like Saipan, an important strategic outpost in the Marianas, to support the massive Japanese garrison station there. These women lived in cramped quarters, often under strict supervision, listening nightly to broadcasts that warned them of American brutality. Stories circulated that capture meant torture, humiliation, or worse. Even without official propaganda, fear moved quickly through communities under siege. By 1944, the situation on Saipan had become desperate. The island had been heavily fortified, but Japan's defensive perimeter was collapsing. American forces, advancing steadily across the Pacific, identified the Marianas as essential for future long-range air operations. If taken, these islands would allow B-29 bombers to reach the Japanese mainland, a strategic shift that could change the course of the war. Thus, when the U.S. Marines and Army's 27th Infantry Division launched the assault on June 15, 1944, they encountered fierce resistance. What followed was one of the most brutal island campaigns of the Pacific. Japanese units defended every cave, ridge, and pocket of jungle. Suicide charges, night attacks, and entrenched positions turned Saipan into a landscape of smoke, shattered coral, and constant danger. For civilian women, the battle was a nightmare of collapsing shelters, dwindling food, and constant bombardment. Many fled into the island's interior, hiding among cliffs and ravines. Some followed military units, offering medical aid or carrying supplies. Others stayed in caves for days without light. With communication cut and leadership fragmented, rumors replaced orders. As American forces pushed deeper inland, Panic spread across the remaining civilian population. It was within this chaos that another layer of fear took hold. Japanese soldiers, often believing they were sparing civilians from worse fates, told women that surrender was not an option. They repeated stories of American cruelty, stories that, for most, were the only information they had ever heard about the outside world. Mothers whispered to daughters that capture meant dishonor. Some were ordered to take their own lives rather than fall into enemy hands. Entire families made desperate leaps from cliffs, believing death preferable to capture. This environment shaped the terrified surrender of the women who walked out on that July morning. They carried generations of belief that the enemy would see them as less than human. Yet, despite everything they had been told, the Americans they met did not fit the image painted by wartime propaganda. But to understand their shock, one must also understand the American perspective. By 1944, U.S. forces had encountered Japanese soldiers who rarely surrendered. They witnessed attacks, even from wounded or isolated troops. Many Marines had learned to approach any advancing figure with extreme caution. The idea of civilians, especially women, surrendering voluntarily was unusual and unexpected. Still, official U.S. policy regarding civilians was clear. They were to be treated humanely, given food, medical care, and protection. American military administration on Saipan aimed to stabilize the population, gather displaced civilians, and prevent further tragedy. That contrast between expectation and reality is what made the moment so transformative. And it is within this wider context, a clash of ideologies, desperation, and the collapse of a belief system, that the turning point would unfold more profoundly. Now, with the battlefield's conditions shaped and fear defined, the deeper historical forces behind this moment come into view. The forces that led Japanese women to be astonished when Americans treated them not as enemies, but as equals. The shock felt by the women on Saipan was not an isolated reaction. Across the scattered islands of the Central and South Pacific, similar scenes unfolded as the tides of war shifted and Japan's defensive perimeter collapsed. From Tinian to Guam, from Peleliu to Luzon, women who had survived bombardment, starvation, and propaganda emerged from caves, burned-out villages, and medical stations carrying the same emotional burden, terror of what surrender meant. In their minds, shaped by years of militarized indoctrination, surrender was synonymous with annihilation. Yet what awaited them challenged every expectation. American units advancing island by island encountered Japanese women in various roles: civilians, nurses, clerks, communication staff, even volunteer corps auxiliaries. Their appearances varied, some weak from dehydration, others still in uniform, others carrying infants on their backs. But one reaction remained constant: disbelief that the enemy, painted as a ruthless monster, treated them with restraint and even recognition of their dignity. The United States military had its own internal contradictions. Fierce combat against a fanatically fighting opponent hardened many soldiers. Hatred, fear, and suspicion were common. Yet, regulations remained clear. Non-combatants and prisoners were to be treated according to established standards. Commanders held briefings, reminding Marines and Army infantry that civilians were not combatants, and women, whatever their allegiance, were to be handled with strict discipline. Military police units and medical corpsmen were often the first to interact with surrender groups, providing water, blankets, or medical attention. Many American servicemen were surprised themselves, expecting hostility but receiving instead silence, bowed heads, and stunned expressions. On Saipan, photographs captured the first lines of women being registered by military police, their faces gaunt yet composed. These images would later circulate widely, offering the American public a rare glimpse into the human side of an enemy society previously portrayed as wholly foreign and impenetrable. In the aftermath of battle, These civilian encounters softened perceptions, reminding both sides of the shared human costs of war. For the women, each interaction with an American serviceman became a moment of reevaluation. Their captors, far from the violent caricatures they had been taught to fear, followed protocols, issued rations, and occasionally offered small gestures of comfort. In some cases, women expressed amazement at being spoken to as individuals. American medics asked their names, ages, wounds, and conditions, a simple act that, for POWs who expected brutality, carried profound psychological weight. Even more striking was the insistence on equal distribution of food and water. Though supplies were limited and often stretched thin across thousands of displaced civilians, the Americans attempted to administer order with consistency. Pregnant women and those with infants were prioritized, a policy that shocked many who had believed Western forces had no concept of compassion. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence units quickly realized that female prisoners could provide critical but often overlooked insights into Japanese morale, logistics, and civilian suffering. Their testimonies, although cautious and filtered through fear, revealed the extent of imperial propaganda and the desperate conditions in the final months of Japan's island defenses. Many recounted how military authorities warned that Americans would commit atrocities, encouraging whole communities to embrace mass suicide rather than surrender. This mindset became tragically visible on Okinawa and Saipan, where thousands chose death over capture. But for those who survived, surrender brought not annihilation, but the first stable shelter they had seen in weeks. The Americans, too, learned from these encounters. They saw firsthand how deeply Japan's militarist ideology had penetrated civilian life, shaping expectations even for women who had never taken part in combat. They encountered mothers trembling as they handed over their children, convinced they might never see them again. Young nurses bowing repeatedly, apologizing for their perceived failure to die with honor. Clerks clutching notebooks or personal items as if expecting them to be confiscated or destroyed. Yet, as hours turned into days, and days into weeks, mistrust slowly eroded. Women in temporary internment areas were assigned living quarters, given blankets, and provided consistent meals. Hygiene stations were set up, medical screenings conducted, and interpreters brought in. What emerged in these spaces was a tentative coexistence, still tense, still shaped by wartime realities, but undeniably human. This shift did not erase the war's horrors, nor the suffering endured by American troops. Many soldiers had endured brutal jungle fighting, sniper ambushes, and suicide attacks mere days earlier. But training, discipline, and command oversight prevented widespread misconduct. The women, observing this discipline, gradually understood that their survival did not depend on servitude or silence, but on a system far different from what they had imagined. For the first time, many realized they were not considered spoils of war or enemies awaiting execution. They were treated as individuals within a larger humanitarian process. This quiet transformation within temporary camps and holding areas laid the groundwork for what would come next. The evolution of trust, the emergence of small yet powerful interactions, and the deep psychological impact these moments would leave on the women long after the guns fell silent. And it is in this fragile space of uncertainty and discovery that a new perspective began to take shape. One that would illuminate not only the women's experiences, but also the broader moral and strategic calculations shaping the Pacific War's end. For years, Japanese women, whether civilians, nurses, or clerks, had lived under a constant stream of militarized propaganda. From schoolrooms to radio broadcasts, the message was unambiguous. Surrender meant dishonor, and the Americans meant torture, humiliation, or death. Many had memorized the warnings by heart. So when they finally stepped from caves, bunkers, or burned settlements into American custody, the moment felt like stepping off a precipice with no certainty of what awaited. Yet the scene they encountered was not the nightmare they had prepared themselves for. American medical corpsmen administered first aid with clinical calmness. Military police handed out canteens and ration biscuits. Soldiers whose uniforms were still dusty from battle spoke in steady, structured tones, giving instructions through interpreters rather than through violence. Some women wept openly, not from fear, but from the release of a terror that had consumed them for months. The shock was not simply emotional, it was existential. For many, this was the first time they had ever witnessed an enemy as human. The strict regulation of American troops, the insistence on fair treatment, and the unexpected respect for personal boundaries eroded decades of indoctrination in a matter of hours. Mothers found their children given water before the adults. Elderly women were offered blankets. Pregnant prisoners were escorted forward for medical checks. Every gesture, however small, dismantled a layer of fear. And in that fragile unraveling, the women began to recognize a truth almost too overwhelming to process. They had been wrong about their enemy, and that realization reshaped not only their survival, but their understanding of the world beyond Japan's wartime isolation. This emotional shift, rooted in lived experience rather than propaganda, became the foundation for a second, equally significant transformation, one tied to the strict discipline and ethical structure that shaped American military conduct. On the American side, the treatment of female Japanese prisoners was not accidental nor entirely sentimental. It was guided by a structured understanding of military discipline, intelligence value, and a need to maintain order in chaotic environments. Commanders recognized that the collapse of Japanese island defenses often left thousands of civilians, many of them women and children, wandering in dire conditions. Mishandling them would create unnecessary chaos and undermine operational objectives. Thus, discipline became not only a moral stance, but a strategic requirement. American troops were repeatedly briefed on conduct guidelines. Prisoners, regardless of gender or nationality, were to be handled under existing protocols. Violations were punishable. Officers insisted that order was maintained not through intimidation, but through predictability, structure, and professionalism. For many frontline soldiers, this framework provided emotional boundaries after the brutal close-quarter fighting that had characterized the Pacific War. The presence of female prisoners added another layer of complexity. Commanders understood that misconduct, even isolated, could damage morale, fuel Japanese propaganda, and complicate intelligence operations. Therefore, they emphasized restraint as part of the mission itself. Military police units were trained to separate women from combat zones, assign them controlled spaces, and ensure that humanitarian procedures were followed. To the women witnessing this discipline, the effect was profound. Instead of chaos, they observed structure. Instead of vengeance, they saw procedure. Instead of domination, they experienced regulation. This disciplined environment did more than keep order. It subtly communicated that the Americans viewed them not as trophies of war, but as individuals governed under rules. And in that clarity, the women began encountering yet another unexpected dynamic. The emergence of small, cautious human connections formed in the fragile aftermath of battle. Among all the American personnel the women encountered, none had a greater impact on their perceptions than translators, medics, and support staff who engaged with them directly. These were the individuals who asked questions, checked injuries, explained procedures, or guided them through holding areas. Their interactions were brief, often minimalist, and always professional, but they carried immense psychological weight. Japanese-speaking Nisei interpreters played a particularly vital role. Many were second-generation Japanese Americans serving in the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Service. To the women, hearing their own language spoken calmly by someone wearing an American uniform was more than surprising. It was disorienting. These interpreters explained that they were not there to punish, but to record names, confirm identities, and assess needs. Their presence alone dissolved barriers built over years of wartime propaganda. American medics, too, became silent anchors of reassurance. They approached wounds without hesitation, cleaned cuts, stabilized broken limbs, and treated infections with practiced hands. For women accustomed to the harsh, resource-limited conditions of Japanese field hospitals, this level of care felt almost unreal. Some reported feeling embarrassed to receive medical attention from the enemy. Others felt relief strong enough to bring them to tears. Small moments. An interpreter offering reassurance. A corpsman kneeling to bandage a foot. A guard helping a mother carry water. Became turning points. These encounters forged a fragile bridge between captor and captive, grounded not in ideology, but in simple humanity. And through these small acts, the women began to understand that their treatment was not an exception, but part of a consistent system. It was this emerging clarity, rooted in quiet moments rather than grand gestures, that paved the way for deeper insights into how both sides reevaluated their assumptions, beliefs, and moral frameworks. For years, the Japanese state had relied on a vast propaganda system that permeated every level of society: schools, newspapers, radio broadcasts, military handbooks, and even children's songs. The message was unwavering. The Allies, especially Americans, were brutal, merciless, and capable of unspeakable acts. Women were warned they would face violation or death if captured. Surrender was depicted as a fate worse than annihilation. Mothers repeated these warnings to daughters. Nurses whispered them to new recruits. No one questioned the narrative. Questioning was unthinkable. Yet on the ground, in the humid islands of the Pacific or in the rubble of collapsing strongholds, lived experience began to contradict the story. The women discovered that American soldiers operated within boundaries, rigid ones. Prisoners were not beaten. Civilians were not arbitrarily harmed. Food was distributed according to need, not rank. Guards maintained distance and discipline. Even the simple act of allowing a mother to comfort her crying child challenged the darkest warnings they had internalized. With every passing day, the gulf between propaganda and reality widened. It was not merely a political disillusionment. It was cultural shock of the deepest kind. A lifetime of ideological conditioning unraveled through acts so mundane they barely registered to the Americans performing them. Yet they carried immense psychological force for the women witnessing them. As propaganda collapsed, something else took its place: the earliest seeds of reassessment. Beliefs shifted, fears softened, hostility gave way to uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, new questions began to form. Questions the women had never dared ask before the war began to fracture around them. These shifting perceptions would soon collide with an even more powerful moment, the point when the Americans made a choice that defied every wartime expectation. The cultural gap between Japanese women and American troops was immense. Honor, shame, and hierarchy shaped every aspect of Japanese society. To be captured was already a profound humiliation. To be treated kindly by one's enemy introduced a secondary layer of internal conflict. Some women felt grateful. Others felt suspicious. Many felt both at once. Americans, meanwhile, operated under a very different framework, one shaped by military procedure rather than cultural philosophy. Their treatment of prisoners stemmed from a mix of formal regulations, institutional discipline, and a desire to maintain stability in chaotic operational environments. The women interpreted kindness through an emotional and cultural lens. The Americans delivered it through training and expectation. This clash produced moments of quiet confusion. When American guards bowed their heads slightly to acknowledge passing women, a gesture of politeness, not dominance, some prisoners interpreted it as respect they no longer believed they deserved. When soldiers refused to search women without a female attendant present, the women saw an unexpected restraint that contradicted everything they had been taught about Western soldiers. Even the act of offering food could feel complicated. Sharing rations suggested equality, but equality itself conflicted with Japanese wartime propaganda, which had insisted Americans viewed them as subhuman. Reconciling these contradictions was a slow, deeply personal struggle. And yet, through that struggle, a subtle truth began to surface. The two sides were not natural enemies shaped by fate, but human beings following cultural frameworks that had collided violently through war. This realization, delicate and fragile, would become critical during the defining moment that changed everything, an event that marked a turning point not only for the women, but for their place in the final chapters of the conflict. Among the Japanese women, there were quiet observers, nurses trained to notice detail, clerks accustomed to documentation, civilians with sharp recollections shaped by survival. These women watched everything: guard rotations, tone of voice, how Americans responded to disputes, and how they handled the wounded. These observations became the emotional and historical backbone of their memory of captivity. They noted the absence of cruelty. They observed the predictability of routines. They recorded how American medics prioritized injured individuals over military hierarchy. They remembered that even in tense or chaotic moments, American troops rarely raised their voices. These impressions formed the basis of countless post-war testimonies, diaries, and oral histories describing the unexpected humanity they encountered. Some observers wrote secretly. Others memorized details to preserve them until liberation. Many reflected on how their experience contrasted sharply with Japan's portrayal of Allied troops. In the years after the war, these women would recount what they had witnessed in interviews, memoirs, and reunions with academics, shaping an important historical narrative. The American treatment of female Japanese prisoners was not only fair, but morally grounded. This careful witnessing created a bridge between personal experiences and historical record, ensuring that these unexpected interactions were not lost to time, but preserved as evidence of how restraint, structure, and humanity could exist even within the machinery of total war. And it is from these testimonies that we now arrive at the decisive, transformative scene, the moment when the Americans made a choice that neither the women nor the war itself could have predicted. The final turning point of this story does not begin with a dramatic battle, a clash of armies, or a decisive strategic map. It begins with a moment of silence. A silence inside a makeshift processing station on Luzon in late February 1945, broken only by the rustle of papers and the murmured voices of American interrogators trying to identify thousands of Japanese captives now in their custody. By this stage of the Pacific War, the U.S. Army had swept through large parts of the Philippines and pockets of surviving Japanese troops. Wounded, starving, exhausted, were surrendering in unprecedented numbers. Among them were hundreds of Japanese women who had served as nurses, auxiliaries, clerks, and, in some cases, members of military support detachments who had followed the collapsing imperial lines as they retreated southward. Many of these women had spent years immersed in one message: Americans do not take prisoners. And if they do, women will suffer unspeakable things. These beliefs were not a margin of wartime rumor. They were state doctrine. Propaganda leaflets and military briefings told Japanese women that surrender meant torture, rape, or forced mutilation at the hands of the barbaric West. Better to die, better to take one's own life, if necessary. Yet the fighting around Manila had shown them something contradictory. American medical teams tended not only to captured soldiers, but also to civilian casualties, including Japanese. U.S. signal companies paused operations to evacuate women and children found hiding in shattered buildings. Surrendering nurses were escorted, not assaulted. Still, disbelief ran deep. The decisive moment came when the U.S. Sixth Army opened a classified processing area specifically for captured Japanese female auxiliaries. American officers did this not out of chivalry, but practicality. They needed to separate military personnel from civilians, gather intelligence on unit structures, and prevent potential sabotage or infiltration. Yet this administrative decision would become the emotional and psychological turning point of the entire narrative. Hundreds of Japanese women, exhausted, malnourished, still in tattered uniforms, were lined up for registration. Many were trembling. A few clutched hidden razor blades or shards of glass, prepared to end their lives if the stories turned out to be true. But instead of brutality, they encountered order. American MPs distributed canteens of clean water. Medical corpsmen inspected wounds without hostility. Signage was posted in Romanized Japanese to help women understand where to go. Interpreters, Nisei soldiers from the Military Intelligence Service, spoke to them in calm, fluent Japanese. This was the moment that shattered indoctrination. One interpreter, a young MIS linguist from California, later recounted that the Japanese nurses refused to sit in chairs assigned to them, not out of defiance, but because they believed sitting while Americans stood would be punished. The Americans insisted, gently but firmly, "Please sit. It's okay. You are safe." Many women stood frozen, convinced it was a trick. What happened next broke the last wall of fear. A group of U.S. Army nurses, women, entered the processing station to help treat infected wounds, tropical ulcers, and malaria cases among the captured auxiliaries. For the Japanese prisoners, this was unimaginable. Female enemy personnel treated by female enemy nurses as equals in need of medical care. One Japanese auxiliary, recalling this moment decades later, said, "I could not believe American women touched us without hatred. We were the enemy. Yet they cleaned our wounds. They shared their own medicine. I had never seen such a thing." This was the turning point when indoctrination collapsed under the weight of lived experience. The sight of American women in uniform providing compassion upended every belief these prisoners had been taught about the Western world, gender roles, and wartime hierarchy. Word spread quickly among the prisoners. The Americans were not going to mistreat them. They were not going to be assaulted. They were not going to be executed. They were not going to be humiliated. They were simply going to be processed, registered, fed, and treated like any other POW. And so the emotional landscape shifted. Fear gave way to stunned curiosity. Mistrust gave way to hesitant engagement. Many Japanese women began asking quiet questions about American society, about women having ranks, about women voting, about women working as officers and medical specialists. For the first time, the idea that women could serve in uniform with authority was laid before them not as propaganda, but as something real, visible, and undeniable. This processing station, little more than a cluster of tents and tables, became the decisive fulcrum of the entire event, a place where the psychological battle ended, where the empire's indoctrination finally broke, where captives became, not admirers, but witnesses to a different world, a world they had been told did not exist. And yet the climax had only begun, because this shift in perception would soon lead to one of the most unexpected, humanizing scenes of the Pacific War, one that would permanently alter how these women understood their captors and themselves. The following days transformed mere disbelief into cautious engagement. Inside the tents of the Sixth Army's temporary processing station, Japanese female prisoners began to receive small freedoms within the framework of captivity, a stark contrast to the rigid control they had known under imperial rule. They were allowed to keep personal belongings, write letters, and even keep diaries. For the Japanese women, the significance was monumental. In their training, the idea of recording thoughts for posterity, without censorship, without reprisal, was inconceivable. Diaries had been considered dangerous. Personal reflection was a privilege reserved for officers or propaganda writers loyal to the empire. Now, these women were given paper, pencils, and the ability to document events, their emotions, and, most importantly, their humanity. Many of them hesitated at first, unsure if each stroke of ink might lead to punishment. Some wrote about the physical discomfort of the camps, the relentless humidity of Luzon, the flies, the coarse blankets, the hunger, but more striking were the entries that detailed astonishment at the treatment they received. One nurse noted the calm, professional manner of the American female medics. They treat us like human beings, not the enemy, not criminals, humans. I cannot comprehend it, yet I see it. These small acts, the writing of diaries, the asking of questions, the observing of medical procedures, were revolutionary. The women began to test boundaries in subtle ways, asking permission to walk between tents, requesting blankets for sick companions, volunteering for minor tasks. Every request that was met with calm acquiescence, rather than force or intimidation, reinforced the reality of humane treatment. Outside the tents, the Americans enforced strict yet non-threatening order. Fences remained. Watchtowers remained. Armed MPs patrolled. But the prisoners quickly realized the difference between coercion and structured guidance. When a nurse tried to visit an off-limit area, she was redirected with a gesture, a firm but gentle explanation, and a liberty to try another path. The psychological effect was profound. Trust replaced fear. Compliance was no longer enforced through intimidation. It emerged naturally, out of recognition that responsible action was rewarded with respect. One particularly telling moment occurred during an inspection of the camp's latrines and wash areas. A Japanese auxiliary, whose uniform had long been tattered and marked with the grime of forced labor, was allowed to clean her own area according to her own schedule. No guards hovered. No officer demanded perfection. The result was astonishing. Efficiency improved. Areas remained clean. Minor infractions, once inevitable under strict coercion, almost disappeared. The women had internalized a system of discipline built on trust, not fear. Letters and diaries became a conduit for reflection. Prisoners documented not only the physical details of camp life, but the unexpected kindness they witnessed. A 22-year-old nurse wrote, "I see now that we were wrong about them. Not all Americans are cruel. We feared them because we were told to. And yet, every day, their actions contradict our lessons." These entries would later serve as invaluable historical evidence, corroborated by official Army reports and post-war memoirs. A turning point in morale occurred when the women were allowed supervised walks in the open courtyard. They moved tentatively at first, clutching coats around their shoulders, scanning watchtowers for signs of betrayal. Then they began to smile. They paused to observe sunlight on the wet, mud-slick ground. They conversed in low voices. Small acts, stretching arms, walking side by side, even laughing, became symbolic of a reclaimed humanity. The American commanders noted these developments meticulously. Reports emphasized that the experiment validated the hypothesis. Measured autonomy encourages responsible behavior. The presence of authority figures was still necessary, but it did not require constant assertion. Trust became a tool as effective as punishment. By the third week, the psychological transformation was unmistakable. The women were no longer prisoners defined solely by fear. They were collaborators in the maintenance of order, participants in a framework that allowed both security and dignity. The diaries grew longer, observations more nuanced. They recorded lessons learned, questions about the outside world, reflections on ethics and morality, and, most importantly, a realization that autonomy and respect could coexist even amidst the machinery of war. For the American soldiers and medics, the experience was equally instructive. It demonstrated that humane treatment of enemy personnel was not a weakness. It reinforced operational efficiency improved intelligence collection, and left a lasting imprint on the ethos of U.S. military conduct in the Pacific theater. In retrospect, this sequence of events, fear, disbelief, observation, tentative engagement, and eventual cautious participation, constituted the climax of the prisoner's wartime experience. It was a rare, humanizing episode in a conflict defined by destruction and cruelty. Through the simple yet profound gestures of recognition, trust, and dignity, these women came to understand that their captors could act morally and professionally. The diaries, the walks, the conversations, the quiet acts of responsibility, all these moments intertwined to create a turning point that would ripple through the remainder of their captivity and in a post-war memory. It was a climax not of explosions or bullets, but of humanity asserting itself, quiet, measured, and transformative. The weeks following the granting of measured freedom in the camp revealed a transformation both subtle and profound. The Japanese women, once constrained by rigid hierarchies and constant surveillance, began to navigate their environment with cautious confidence. Every small decision, when to eat, which chores to perform first, whether to converse with a fellow prisoner, became an assertion of self within boundaries carefully maintained by the Americans. Camp officers observed a marked improvement in morale. Reports from the guards noted that conflicts among prisoners decreased. Minor disputes, once frequent in the tense and crowded environment, became almost negligible. Participation in educational activities, vocational workshops, and language lessons increased steadily. The women approached these programs with enthusiasm, not compulsion. They began to tutor one another, offering guidance in practical skills and literacy, forming informal networks of support. One young nurse, writing in her diary, remarked on the odd sensation of agency. I decide when to sweep the floor. I decide how to arrange my bedding. I have never known such freedom, and yet it feels strange, almost frightening. The Americans noted that autonomy had reinforced discipline rather than undermined it. By allowing controlled choice, prisoners internalized a sense of responsibility. When minor infractions occurred, they were handled with calm guidance rather than punishment. The result was a rare alignment. Obedience achieved not through fear, but through mutual recognition of trust. Within the camp, subtle social dynamics evolved. Younger women looked to more experienced nurses for advice, learning the unspoken rhythms of autonomy within captivity. Clerks, previously tasked with menial duties under strict supervision, now assumed leadership roles within small groups, organizing daily tasks and facilitating educational exercises. Older prisoners, who had once endured years of hierarchy, became mentors and mediators, teaching cooperation and patience. Even the mundane tasks of daily life acquired symbolic meaning. Walking through the courtyard, tending the small garden plots, or pausing to write letters became acts of reclamation. A 24-year-old clerk noted, I pause by the garden and watch the snow melting. It feels like something belongs to me again, even if only for a moment. These simple gestures were not mere distractions. They were deliberate assertions of selfhood in a space long defined by control and deprivation. The broader military implications were not lost on Allied observers. Reports highlighted the practical advantages of humane treatment. Efficiency improved. Tasks were completed on time. Surveillance demands decreased. The model demonstrated that trust could coexist with security infrastructure. Fences, watchtowers, and armed patrols remained, yet the environment felt less oppressive, allowing prisoners to engage productively without constant coercion. Psychologically, the impact on the women was enduring. Letters sent home reflected astonishment, gratitude, and cautious optimism. Diaries recorded not only daily life but emotional growth, the realization that dignity could exist even in captivity, that moral behavior from captors was possible, and that personal agency could be exercised safely. The women learned to navigate freedom responsibly, testing boundaries and respecting limits with an awareness they had never been allowed to develop under Japanese military doctrine. At the camp headquarters, commanders compiled these observations into formal reports. They emphasized the value of controlled autonomy. Prisoners who were trusted and treated humanely exhibited greater cooperation, reduced infractions, and higher morale. The principle was clear. The exercise of freedom within boundaries reinforced authority rather than diminishing it. These findings would later influence policies in other theaters of operation, providing a model for humane treatment that balanced security needs with ethical imperatives. For the prisoners themselves, the experience became a touchstone of resilience, shaping not only the remainder of their captivity, but also their post-war lives. Autonomy, even limited, fostered confidence, psychological fortitude, and an enduring sense of human dignity that few anticipated could survive the rigors of war. The long-term significance of this period extended beyond immediate camp life. The combination of trust, structure, and opportunity allowed the women to internalize lessons in responsibility and collaboration that would inform their later reintegration into civilian society. They returned to Japan, to communities disrupted by war, carrying memories of an unusual form of justice and compassion, a stark contrast to the brutality they had known under imperial discipline. The transformation observed in these weeks laid the foundation for the final, lasting consequences of humane captivity: improved morale, reinforced discipline, operational efficiency, and an enduring testament to the ethical power of measured freedom. As the months progressed, the effects of autonomy within the camp became increasingly evident. The initial shock of freedom had evolved into a structured rhythm. Women moved confidently through courtyards, carefully observing boundaries, choosing paths, and forming small social clusters. Leadership roles emerged naturally. Experienced nurses mentored newcomers, clerks organized educational activities, and small committees coordinated daily chores. The camp functioned as a microcosm of self-regulating society, a striking departure from the rigid, coercive systems of captivity elsewhere. Reports documented measurable improvements. Work programs were completed efficiently, disputes were rare, and recreational and educational participation was high. Guards noted that the women, having earned trust through responsible behavior, seldom tested limits unnecessarily. Even when minor deviations occurred, venturing near off-limit storage sheds or lingering at the boundaries, the interventions were calm, measured, and instructive rather than punitive. This approach reinforced the principle that freedom, when granted within a secure framework, encouraged compliance and cooperation. The psychological benefits were profound. Prisoners frequently recorded the significance of small acts, pausing to watch sunlight on snow, walking with companions without instruction, or writing letters and diaries freely. A nurse later recalled, "For the first time in years, I felt that my choices mattered, that I was not merely a number or a prisoner, but a person capable of responsibility and thought." Such reflections underscored how limited freedom could restore agency and rebuild fractured identities. The camp environment also demonstrated subtle shifts in social structure. Informal networks strengthened, mutual support became commonplace, and mentorship provided a foundation for trust. Older prisoners guided the young. Seasoned clerks assumed organizational roles, and shared labor fostered collaboration. This internal adaptation reinforced the lesson that humane treatment could cultivate both discipline and morale simultaneously. Beyond the camp, the wider implications were significant. Reports of ethical treatment reached Japanese authorities, provoking both surprise and concern. Allied leadership recognized the propaganda and moral advantages. Humane management of prisoners underscored the contrast between Allied conduct and the strict, often brutal systems imposed elsewhere. The model demonstrated that ethical policies could serve operational needs while reinforcing human dignity, a precedent that would resonate in post-war deliberations on the treatment of POWs. Upon release, many women carried the lessons of autonomy into civilian life. In post-war Japan, they applied principles of self-reliance, collaboration, and resilience learned in captivity to reconstruction efforts, family life, and professional roles. Memoirs and oral histories consistently highlight the lasting psychological impact. Freedom within boundaries had instilled confidence, accountability, and a renewed sense of self-worth. These experiences subtly reshaped attitudes toward authority, gender roles, and expectations of humane treatment, leaving a legacy far beyond the immediate wartime context. Operationally, the camps served as proof of concept. Measured freedom did not erode control. Rather, it optimized camp management. Prisoners acted responsibly when trusted, compliance improved, and morale soared. For military planners and historians, this period offered a case study in balancing security and ethics, demonstrating that compassion and structure could coexist effectively even amidst global conflict. The story of these Japanese female POWs illustrates a broader truth about human nature. Even in constrained circumstances with fences, towers, and armed oversight, individuals are capable of exercising responsibility, building community, and sustaining dignity when treated ethically. The interaction between trust and autonomy created a transformative environment, a rare wartime experiment that highlighted both moral leadership and human resilience. As this chapter of the camp concluded, it became clear that these weeks of measured freedom left an indelible mark, not only on the prisoners, but on Allied policy, historical record, and the enduring understanding of humane captivity. The aftermath was not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of restored identity, resilience, and hope. This set the stage for reflection on the significance of ethical leadership and the capacity of humans to reclaim agency even in the shadow of war. The story of the Japanese female POWs and their unprecedented freedom within Allied camps remains a striking testament to the human capacity for dignity, resilience, and moral clarity. Even amid the devastation of global conflict, the quiet exercise of trust and measured autonomy revealed that ethical leadership could achieve operational goals without resorting to fear or coercion. The women's tentative steps into open courtyards, the careful choices they made, and the small, symbolic acts of agency, walking, writing, teaching, conversing, were not trivial. They were profound gestures of self-reclamation, asserting identity in a system designed to suppress it. From a psychological perspective, the effects were transformative. Prisoners internalized boundaries, developed informal leadership networks, and rebuilt a sense of self-worth eroded by months of captivity. These adaptations demonstrate a fundamental truth. Humans, when treated with respect and given the freedom to make choices, even constrained ones, can flourish under circumstances that might otherwise seem crushing. Memoirs, letters, and oral histories collected decades later consistently emphasize this point, portraying how autonomy within captivity nurtured both resilience and responsibility. For the Allies, the experiment offered lessons beyond morality. Ethical treatment reinforced compliance, increased efficiency, and reduced conflict. It became evident that operational objectives and humane conduct need not conflict. Rather, they can complement one another. This lesson resonated in policy considerations, influencing both the management of POWs and broader approaches to leadership under duress. Historically, the episode challenges conventional narratives of captivity and wartime authority. It illuminates a rare intersection where compassion, trust, and operational necessity converged, producing an environment where humanity persisted amid the machinery of war. The significance extends beyond the immediate context of a single camp or a single conflict. It offers enduring insight into the capacity of ethical frameworks to shape behavior, preserve dignity, and foster long-lasting psychological and social impact. In the end, these women's experiences serve as a quiet affirmation that even in the darkest chapters of human history, respect, trust, and small liberties hold the power to transform lives. Their journey through measured freedom underscores a timeless principle: that humanity endures not merely through survival, but through the restoration of agency, moral clarity, and the capacity to act with dignity, even when the world around is defined by chaos and conflict. It is a lesson for history, for leadership, and for the human spirit, a reminder that ethical choices, however modest in scale, can leave an impact that resonates far beyond the immediate struggle.